Ms. Naomi Carter walked into the classroom with the air of a storm that had weathered many battles. Her tall frame and graceful poise commanded attention, while her sharp eyes seemed to pierce through the layers of pretension. She was a teacher like no other, a woman of intelligence and conviction, yet burdened by the weight of her past. Born in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and expectations even lower, Naomi had fought tooth and nail for her education. Her passion for teaching wasn't just a career choice. It was her rebellion against a world that had tried to silence her dreams. Yet, beneath her composed exterior lay a woman haunted by struggles, years of enduring systemic bias and the loneliness of always proving her worth. Her teaching style was strict but effective. Students often found her intimidating, but those who looked closer discovered a profound sadness behind her tough exterior. Naomi believed in discipline, not just as a tool for learning but as a means to prepare her students for a world she knew could be unforgiving. Today, however, something was different. Her usual spark of determination seemed dimmed, replaced by a tension that hung heavy in the air. As she glanced at the rows of desks, her gaze lingered on one student, Emma, the quiet white girl who had always seemed out of place in this room. A flicker of emotion crossed Naomi's face, a mixture of frustration and something deeper, harder to name. Unbeknownst to her students, today was the beginning of a lesson neither they nor Naomi herself would ever forget. Emma Grace sat in the corner of the classroom, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized desk. With pale blonde hair cascading over her shoulders and wide blue eyes that seemed to absorb every detail around her, she radiated a quiet charm. Unlike her boisterous classmates, Emma rarely spoke unless spoken to. Her presence was like a whisper, soft yet noticeable to those who cared to listen. At just 9 years old, Emma carried an innocence that was both endearing and fragile. She was the kind of child who doodled on the margins of her notebook, her drawings a blend of vibrant colors and hopeful imaginings. Yet, beneath her shy smile lay the telltale signs of a child navigating loneliness. Emma had recently transferred to this school, a new environment, new faces, and new rules. She came from a privileged background where warmth and love were plentiful, but stepping into a diverse classroom brought challenges she hadn't anticipated. Her polite nature often left her misunderstood, her silence mistaken for aloofness. Despite her reserved demeanor, Emma was perceptive, picking up on the unspoken tensions in the room. She often watched Ms. Carter with a mix of admiration and apprehension, sensing the layers of complexity in her teacher. Emma wasn't afraid of her, but something about Ms. Carter's piercing gaze made her feel exposed, as if every thought she'd ever had could be read like an open book. That morning, Emma sat quietly, her gaze flitting between her notebook and the classroom window. Unaware of the storm brewing, she remained a picture of innocence, a child on the brink of discovering how fragile her small world truly was. The classroom buzzed with the usual hum of students settling in, but an undercurrent of unease rippled through the air. Ms. Carter stood at the front, her gaze sharp and unwavering as she scanned the room. Her eyes briefly rested on Emma, who was quietly scribbling in her notebook, oblivious to the tension building around her. For weeks, a silent friction had been growing between the teacher and her youngest pupil. It wasn't overt, but subtle moments hinted at a disconnect. Emma's timid questions often earned curt replies, her efforts overlooked in favor of more assertive students. There was no outright hostility, yet something about Emma seemed to stir a frustration in Ms. Carter, a frustration she couldn't quite suppress. Emma, on the other hand, felt the weight of her teacher's unspoken judgment. She didn't understand what she had done to earn such indifference, but it made her hesitate, second-guessing herself even when she was sure she knew the answer. That day, as Ms. Carter called the class to order, there was a tension in her voice, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. And for reasons Emma couldn't explain, she felt as though the storm was about to break, and she was standing directly in its path. The classroom was a space of contradictions, brightly lit with sunlight streaming through the large windows, yet heavy with an unspoken weight that seemed to cling to the air. The rhythmic ticking of the clock punctuated the silence, a constant reminder of time inching forward. Ms. Carter's voice, usually steady and commanding, had an edge that morning, a clipped sharpness that set even the most confident students on edge. Emma, sitting near the window, felt the subtle shift more keenly than the others. She had always been attuned to the moods of those around her, and today, something felt off. Her teacher's movements were precise, almost too controlled, as though she were holding back something simmering beneath the surface. The tension wasn't overt, but it was there, in the way Miss Carter's eyes lingered on Emma a moment too long, in the slight hesitation before her words. The other students, sensing the unspoken strain, kept their chatter to a minimum, their usual energy subdued. What no one realized, not even Miss Carter herself, was that this day would mark a turning point. Beneath the surface of routine, forces were at play that would unravel secrets, challenge authority, and alter lives forever. The school was a relic of old architecture, its red brick facade weathered but still standing proud. Nestled in the heart of a suburban community, it served as a melting pot of students from various socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds. The halls buzzed with youthful energy, laughter mixing with hurried footsteps and the occasional slam of locker doors. Yet beneath this lively surface, the school bore the marks of deeper societal divides. The classrooms reflected an unspoken hierarchy. Students from affluent families gravitated toward advanced programs, while those from marginalized communities often found themselves in remedial classes, struggling to navigate a system that felt stacked against them. Ms. Carter's classroom was no exception. It was a place where these contrasts clashed most vividly. Posters promoting diversity and anti-bullying adorned the walls, but their presence felt more symbolic than transformative. Conversations about race, privilege, and power simmered below the surface, rarely addressed but always present. For Miss Carter, the classroom was both a battleground and a sanctuary. As a black woman in a predominantly white institution, she carried the burden of representation. She was determined to uphold high standards, aware that her every action would be scrutinized more harshly than her peers. This pressure, combined with her own internalized struggles, often left her walking a fine line between compassion and discipline. Emma's presence added another layer to the dynamic. As one of the few white students in the class, her innocence and privilege subtly set her apart. She didn't understand the weight of the environment she had stepped into, but her mere existence sometimes served as a silent reminder of disparities that Ms. Carter had spent her life battling. This was more than a school. It was a microcosm of a larger world, where every interaction carried echoes of history, bias, and the potential for change. Ms. Naomi Carter didn't come to teaching by accident. She was born into a world that had told her, repeatedly, that she didn't belong. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of a bustling city, Naomi's family was a blend of strength and struggle. Her mother, a single parent, worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, while Naomi's father, a charismatic yet troubled figure, was often absent, caught in a cycle of addiction and disappointment. From an early age, Naomi learned resilience. She learned that to survive, you had to be strong, and that strength wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, and, above all, academic. In her predominantly white school, Naomi was one of the few black students, and the racism she faced daily shaped her view of the world. Teachers, often well-meaning but unaware of their biases, would offer condescending praise for her intelligence, as though it were a rare commodity for someone like her. Her accomplishments were always seen as exceptions to the rule, rather than the result of hard work and talent. At times, it felt like the more she excelled, the more she was forced to prove her worth. By the time Naomi entered college, she was determined to make a difference. She wanted to teach, not only because she loved learning but because she wanted to empower the next generation of students who, like her, would face systemic barriers. But even in higher education, she encountered obstacles. Professors questioned her credentials, administrators questioned her approach to teaching, and students, especially those from privileged backgrounds, resented her authority. It was a harsh awakening. Naomi quickly learned that her blackness in the classroom was often seen as a threat rather than an asset. As a young teacher, she struggled to find a balance between being an authority figure and remaining compassionate. Her firm stance on discipline often resulted in accusations of being too harsh or too strict, accusations that her white colleagues, who wielded similar authority, rarely faced. The burden of being a black woman in a predominantly white institution made her second-guess every decision. Would her students respect her, or would they see her as an outsider who was simply trying too hard to belong? As she advanced in her career, Naomi developed a sharp edge, a defense mechanism forged from years of fighting battles both external and internal. She learned to control her emotions, to never let her guard down, but in doing so, she often built walls that kept her from truly connecting with her students. Her discipline was rigid, her compassion guarded. She wanted to be liked, but the fear of being perceived as weak, of losing control, was a greater concern. She had seen what happened to teachers who let their guard down. They were undermined, dismissed, or even disrespected. In the classroom, Naomi demanded respect because she feared what would happen if she didn't. But deep inside, a quiet vulnerability lingered. She was exhausted from fighting, exhausted from proving herself time and time again. And yet, she had no choice but to keep going, to continue teaching, to continue being the authority figure her students needed. Whether they understood it or not, Emma Grace had always lived a life of comfort and security. Her home, nestled in a well-to-do neighborhood with white picket fences and manicured lawns, was the epitome of suburban tranquility. Her parents, successful professionals, had ensured that Emma never wanted for anything. She wore the best clothes, attended elite extracurricular programs, and had every modern convenience at her fingertips. Her life was carefully curated, as though everything around her had been designed to offer her the perfect existence. But beneath this veneer of privilege, Emma carried a quiet vulnerability that was largely invisible to those around her. At school, she was a model student, polite, diligent, and always striving to do well. She had a soft voice that barely rose above a whisper and a smile that often flickered nervously, as though unsure of whether she belonged. Emma's classmates tended to overlook her, not out of malice, but because she often appeared detached, an outsider in her own right. Her quiet demeanor, though not unkind, created a distance between her and the others, as if she were a ghost in the room, there but not fully present. Her vulnerability, however, wasn't just a result of her introverted nature. It stemmed from an inner uncertainty that Emma had always struggled to acknowledge. Growing up in an affluent family, she had been shielded from the harsher realities of the world. But when she transferred to this school, things felt different. The diversity of the student body brought complexities she hadn't anticipated. While her classmates came from a range of backgrounds, Emma often found herself isolated, not because of her background, but because of her reluctance to engage. She didn't know how to navigate the unspoken rules that governed interactions in this new environment. She wanted to connect, but the effort often seemed futile, as though no one truly saw her or cared to. At home, her parents were loving but distant. They had high expectations for Emma, not in an overtly demanding way, but in the way that parents who had achieved a great deal tend to subtly convey their hopes for their children. Emma often felt as though she was under constant scrutiny, and no matter how hard she tried, she was never certain if her efforts were good enough. This quiet pressure, combined with her own insecurities, created a storm of emotions inside her. She longed for approval, but it often felt out of reach. In her new school, Emma found herself trying to be someone she wasn't, struggling to fit into a mold she hadn't chosen for herself. The pressure to succeed academically and socially often clashed with her introverted personality. She didn't want to stand out, but the more she tried to blend in, the more she felt her difference. What Emma didn't yet realize was that this vulnerability, the nagging sense that she didn't belong, was beginning to shape her into someone entirely different. She was learning to be cautious, learning to shrink herself in spaces where she felt too large, too exposed. And in the classroom, especially with Ms. Carter, this vulnerability was being quietly tested. Emma wasn't just vulnerable because of her external circumstances, but because she was, in many ways, still learning who she truly was. She was caught between the world of her parents' expectations and the reality of who she was becoming. In Ms. Carter's classroom, Emma would soon realize her vulnerability would be tested in ways that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself. The classroom was a delicate balance of noise and silence. The hum of chatter, the rustling of papers, the occasional cough. Each sound felt amplified, as if it were a signal in the air, carrying an unspoken message. Ms. Carter moved through the rows of desks with a purposeful stride, her heels clicking on the linoleum floor. Her presence felt even before she spoke. To the students, she was a figure of authority, intimidating yet inspiring, commanding yet distant. But for Emma, the distance felt personal, like an invisible barrier that separated them, one that neither of them fully understood. Every morning, Emma arrived early, choosing a seat by the window, where the sunlight would spill across her notebook. It was a quiet corner, a place where she could observe rather than engage. She didn't mind being invisible, at least it allowed her to avoid the complexities of social interactions. But there was always a part of her that wished Ms. Carter would see her, really see her, beyond the walls she'd carefully built around herself. Ms. Carter's eyes often lingered on Emma during lessons, a fleeting glance that felt more like an assessment than a mere look. It was a strange thing, the way Ms. Carter seemed to study her, as if trying to decipher a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. On the surface, their interactions were civil, even polite. But there was something more beneath it, something unspoken. The teacher's tone was firm but not unkind, her feedback sharp but not dismissive. She never singled Emma out, but when she did call on her, the questions felt weighted, like there was something Emma needed to prove, even when the answer was simple. Emma, for her part, never quite knew how to respond. She wanted to speak up, to show Miss Carter that she wasn't just a quiet girl lost in a sea of students. But every time she did, it felt like the words were too soft, too easily ignored. Miss Carter's sharp gaze always seemed to pin her down, and Emma's voice, though not lacking in conviction, became smaller under the weight of it. She was caught in a web of uncertainty. Was Miss Carter's gaze an invitation to be seen, or was it an unspoken challenge? She never could tell. There were days when Emma thought she caught glimpses of something softer in Miss Carter's eyes, moments when the stern exterior cracked ever so slightly, revealing a flicker of empathy, of understanding. But those moments were brief, fleeting, like a shadow passing over the sun. The teacher's demeanor would harden again just as quickly, leaving Emma to wonder if she had imagined it all. For Miss Carter, the tension was different. She had spent years learning to control her emotions, to distance herself from the very students she had promised to help. Yet, every time she looked at Emma, she felt something stir within her, a mixture of admiration and something more uncomfortable. It wasn't just Emma's quiet innocence that drew her attention, but something in the way the girl seemed to withdraw, as though she was trying to hide in plain sight. Naomi couldn't help but feel both protective and frustrated, wondering if Emma knew how much potential she had, and yet seemed so unwilling to embrace it. But the longer the silence stretched, the more Naomi found herself questioning whether it was her own fear of being vulnerable that made Emma's quiet demeanor so difficult to approach. Their interactions, though seemingly neutral, were a constant dance of unspoken words, of hidden emotions swirling just below the surface. In the classroom, it was clear to both of them that something deeper was at play. But neither of them knew yet how far that tension would stretch before it snapped. The day began like any other. The bell rang, students shuffled into their seats, and Ms. Carter walked to the front of the room, her usual poise betraying none of the tension simmering just beneath the surface. Emma sat near the window, her arms wrapped around her textbook, her gaze distant, lost in thought. She had been struggling with the latest assignment, a research project on historical figures, and the anxiety over it had gnawed at her all morning. Ms. Carter's voice broke through her thoughts. "Class, I expect you to have your first draft of the project ready by the end of the week. Let's start by discussing the research you've gathered so far." Emma hesitated for a moment before raising her hand, her voice soft but clear. "Ms. Carter, I'm still not sure if I'm on the right track. I'm having trouble focusing on one main idea." A flicker of frustration crossed Ms. Carter's face, though it was barely perceptible. She had already dealt with students who seemed unprepared, and Emma's question, though legitimate, struck her in a way that Emma didn't expect. Ms. Carter fixed her gaze on Emma, her tone tight. "Emma, you've had more than enough time to start. This project isn't difficult, you should have figured it out by now. It's about organizing your thoughts, something I'm sure you're capable of." The words stung, though Emma couldn't quite place why. She had expected the usual encouragement, not this clipped, almost dismissive response. Her hands fidgeted nervously, and she shifted in her seat, feeling the weight of Ms. Carter's gaze. It wasn't just the question, there was an underlying sharpness in the teacher's words, an impatience that caught Emma off guard. She had heard rumors about Ms. Carter's strictness, but Emma hadn't fully experienced it until now. Another student, Mark, who sat nearby, chimed in with a laugh, clearly trying to defuse the awkwardness. "Don't worry, Emma, we all know how tough Ms. Carter can be with deadlines." Ms. Carter's eyes narrowed, and the smile she had once worn so confidently now seemed forced. "Is that supposed to be funny, Mark?" she snapped, her voice biting. The classroom fell silent. Emma felt her heart race, the discomfort settling deeper in her chest. She hadn't expected Ms. Carter to respond that way, not with Mark, not in front of everyone. Her stomach churned as the atmosphere shifted, the playful dynamic turning cold. It was like watching a balloon deflate, the tension in the air palpable. For a moment, the teacher seemed to take a breath, reining herself back in, but the damage had been done. Emma felt herself shrink further into her seat. She hadn't intended to cause this disruption, yet somehow, she had. She wished she could disappear, but her eyes met Ms. Carter's for just a moment, and the exchange, however brief, sent a ripple through both of them. Emma wanted to speak up, to defend herself, to say something, anything, but the words stuck in her throat. Ms. Carter cleared her throat, her voice now forcedly calm, though the tension lingered in every syllable. "All right, Emma, let's take this offline. We'll discuss your concerns after class. But for now, focus on the work." Emma nodded, her hands clenched around the edge of her desk. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted, something that had always been there beneath the surface, but now, it felt more real, more dangerous. As the lesson continued, Emma could no longer focus. She glanced at the other students, who were too absorbed in their own work to notice the shift in atmosphere. But Emma couldn't help feeling that this moment, the clash of authority and vulnerability, had ignited something that couldn't easily be undone. Meanwhile, Ms. Carter stood at the front of the room, fighting an internal battle she hadn't expected. Her patience, always tested in her role as the sole black teacher in a predominantly white school, had been stretched to the limit. The frustration she had buried for so long had bubbled to the surface, and Emma, perhaps unintentionally, had triggered it. But even as the lesson wore on, Ms. Carter's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment when the thin line she'd been walking would finally snap, the moment Emma lowered her eyes after Ms. Carter's sharp response. She thought the tension would dissipate, that the uncomfortable silence would eventually fade as the lesson continued. But the undercurrent of hostility in the air lingered like a storm waiting to break. Emma tried to refocus on her notes, her hands still trembling slightly. She could feel her pulse thudding in her ears, and the harshness of Ms. Carter's words echoed in her mind. "I should have just stayed quiet." But Ms. Carter, too, was struggling to regain control. The faint pulse of anger she had managed to suppress was now impossible to ignore. She had been on edge all week, distracted by her ongoing internal battles, worn thin by the pressure of maintaining her authority in a school that scrutinized every move she made. The frustration she had held in check for so long had exploded in a flash, and now she was trying to reel it back, but it was slipping away from her grip. Her eyes darted across the classroom, searching for anything to steady her. She saw a few students glancing between each other, their discomfort palpable. Mark, the one who had made the offhand comment earlier, shifted uneasily in his seat, sensing that the tension had taken a sharper turn. Naomi's grip on the chalk in her hand tightened, and for a moment, she considered apologizing. She had always prided herself on being a compassionate teacher, someone who would listen to her students, who would empathize with their struggles. Yet, today, something was different. A moment passed, then another. Ms. Carter cleared her throat, her gaze briefly flicking to Emma. "Emma," she said, her voice suddenly sharp and authoritative again. "I need you to focus. You're not the only one struggling. I can't hold your hand through every assignment." The words, though meant to snap Emma back to the task at hand, felt like a whip crack, and Emma flinched. The classroom, once a place of relative peace, had transformed into a battleground. Ms. Carter's control, so carefully constructed over the years, was beginning to crumble. She paced the front of the room, trying to collect herself, but the pressure of her own emotions was becoming unbearable. The looks of students around her didn't help. They all seemed to sense the shift, an energy that was too sharp, too raw for the classroom. Emma's eyes stayed fixed on the desk in front of her, willing herself not to cry, not to make the situation worse. She wanted to protest, to say that she was trying, that she wasn't lazy or inattentive, but the words were locked in her throat. Every part of her was telling her to stay small, to stay quiet. Ms. Carter noticed the silence, the tension that was now thick enough to choke the air. Something about Emma's withdrawn posture made Naomi's frustration fester, and she found herself losing her grip even more. "You think you're the only one who's under pressure?" Naomi snapped, her voice sharper now, her tone harder than it had ever been before. "I've been teaching for years. I've dealt with worse than you can imagine, and I don't need your excuses." Emma looked up, startled by the intensity of the words, but she quickly regretted it. There was no mistaking the cruelty now, the venom in Ms. Carter's voice. It was as though the mask of the compassionate teacher had been ripped away, and in its place stood a person overwhelmed by the very authority she was meant to wield. "Everyone in this room has something to contribute," Ms. Carter continued, her hands gripping the chalkboard as if she might shatter it with her bare hands. "But if you can't even focus on this simple project, then what are you really here for?" Emma recoiled, her face burning with embarrassment. It was as if Ms. Carter had turned the entire room against her in an instant, reducing her to nothing more than a failure. She could feel the eyes of her classmates, no longer just observing but judging. And in that moment, it wasn't just about the project anymore. It was about something deeper. A shift had occurred. Ms. Carter immediately saw the effect her words had on Emma. The girl's shoulders had hunched, her eyes clouded with a mix of hurt and fear. Naomi's stomach twisted in guilt, but the emotion was buried under the weight of her own frustration. She didn't apologize. She couldn't, because to apologize would mean admitting she had lost control, that she was no longer the teacher she had always strived to be. For a moment, the room held its breath. Emma had withdrawn so completely into herself that she was barely visible, a shadow among shadows. Ms. Carter, feeling the coldness between them now, continued the lesson, but it was obvious to everyone that the dynamic had changed. What had started as a simple classroom interaction had exploded into something more profound, a moment that neither the teacher nor the student could walk away from unchanged. Emma sat motionless at her desk, the words of Ms. Carter still echoing in her head like a bitter refrain. The sharp sting of the teacher's accusation hung in the air, filling the space between them with an oppressive weight. She had always prided herself on being invisible, on slipping through the cracks of the classroom without drawing attention to herself. But now, it seemed as though all the quiet corners she had carved for herself had been swept away in an instant. She was exposed, vulnerable, and for the first time, Emma felt the full force of it. The room felt suffocating, the hum of the fluorescent lights above her growing louder with each passing second. She could hear her classmates shifting uncomfortably in their seats, though they didn't dare make eye contact with her. Their silence was a deafening reminder of how alone she felt. No one spoke up to defend her. No one offered a word of kindness, not even a glance of sympathy. They had all seen the way Ms. Carter's words had cut through her, and now, they were all pretending it hadn't happened. Emma's fingers trembled as they gripped the edge of her desk, the sharpness of the wood digging into her palms. She fought the overwhelming urge to stand up and leave the room, to escape from the suffocating gaze of her teacher and the suffocating silence that threatened to swallow her whole. But she couldn't move. She was frozen, trapped in a state of paralysis that went beyond physical stillness. It was as though every ounce of courage had been drained from her in that moment, leaving behind nothing but fear. Her thoughts spiraled, each one more self-critical than the last. Why didn't I just keep quiet? Why did I have to ask that question? Why did I have to be the one to make her angry? Emma's self-doubt was suffocating, curling itself tightly around her chest, making it hard to breathe. The weight of Ms. Carter's harsh words felt unbearable, but it was more than that. It was the realization that she was no longer seen as a student who needed help. She wasn't someone who could be nurtured and guided. No, she was a problem now. A burden. The fear gnawed at her insides, but it wasn't just the fear of failure. It was the fear of being seen as weak, of showing vulnerability. Emma had learned early on to bury her feelings, to hide them beneath a carefully constructed exterior. She had grown used to walking through the world unnoticed, quiet and small, a reflection of what people expected her to be. But now, it seemed that her very silence had become a problem. Ms. Carter's scrutiny, once a distant but familiar force, now felt invasive, harsh, and suffocating. Emma's mind raced, searching for a way to make this moment go away, to undo the damage. She wished she could shrink into the walls, disappear into the cracks between the floorboards. She wanted to scream, to shout that she wasn't lazy, that she was trying, but those words never came. Instead, all she could do was nod, her head bowed low, hoping to fade into the background. What struck her most, however, was the silence that followed the teacher's outburst. Ms. Carter hadn't apologized. No one had spoken in her defense. Emma was left to wrestle with the weight of the moment alone, to bear the sting of her teacher's words without a single word of comfort. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the fear wasn't just about Ms. Carter's anger. It was about the growing divide between them, the widening gap that Emma couldn't bridge no matter how hard she tried. She had always known there was something about Ms. Carter that made her nervous, that kept her on edge. But now, that unease had transformed into something far more visceral, a fear of being rejected, a fear that her teacher no longer saw her as a student in need of guidance, but as someone who couldn't measure up. It wasn't the anger in Ms. Carter's voice that scared Emma. It was the way she had been dismissed, the way her question had been seen as an inconvenience, a weakness to be scorned. Emma's chest tightened as she felt the sting of tears rise in her eyes, but she fought them back. She couldn't cry, not here, not in front of everyone. Not in front of Ms. Carter, whose eyes seemed to pierce through her with an intensity that felt both cold and suffocating. She had always been taught to hide her emotions, to keep them locked away and out of sight. But in this moment, as the silence stretched between them, Emma's resistance began to crumble. It was the quietest kind of rebellion, the refusal to accept the narrative being forced upon her. The desire to rise above the crushing weight of her own fear and find a way to stand up for herself, though she didn't yet know how. For now, Emma remained still, a silent protest against the power imbalance that had momentarily taken control of her world. But beneath the surface, something was stirring, a quiet, unspoken determination to reclaim her voice, no matter how long it took. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the class, Emma's heart seemed to beat in time with its chime, the sudden rush of sound jolting her from the trance she had slipped into. She gathered her things mechanically, the weight of Ms. Carter's words still pressing down on her chest. She hadn't heard a word of the lesson after that moment. Everything had blurred into white noise, drowned out by the pounding in her ears. She stood, hesitating for a moment before slowly making her way to the door, her footsteps feeling heavier with each step. Her classmates filed out ahead of her, chatting in groups, their voices a distant hum. No one spoke to her. Not even Mark, who had once tried to ease the tension with a laugh. He had barely looked at her since. Emma glanced back at the front of the room, where Miss Carter stood, still at the chalkboard, her back turned, scribbling something that Emma couldn't make out. There was something about the way Miss Carter held herself in that moment, her posture rigid, her shoulders tense, that struck Emma. It wasn't just the anger she had felt earlier. There was something darker beneath it, a quiet storm that Emma couldn't quite place but could feel creeping in the air. She left the classroom without another word, the door clicking shut behind her. But as she walked down the hallway, a knot twisted in her stomach. The unease she had felt in the classroom hadn't left her, it had only grown. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between her and Ms. Carter. Something unspoken, something that would unravel in the days to come. And though Emma didn't yet understand what that something was, she knew one thing. The peace she had once felt in the classroom was gone, replaced by an uncertainty that felt like a storm waiting to break. In the days following the classroom incident, the atmosphere in Ms. Carter's class had shifted drastically. What had been a relatively controlled environment, a place where students could make mistakes and learn from them, had become a place of tension, heavy with unspoken rules and silent expectations. The once open and welcoming classroom was now an arena where every action felt measured, every word weighted. Emma had become acutely aware of this change, and as the days wore on, she began to feel more like a spectator in her own life, passively enduring each lesson, each exchange. Ms. Carter's demeanor had altered too. Where once there had been an undercurrent of patience, a careful attempt to balance authority with empathy, now there was only an edge of something darker, a sharpness to her voice, an impatience that cut through even the most innocent of questions. The subtle shifts began in the smallest of ways, a glance that lingered too long, a slight edge to her tone when Emma was late handing in an assignment. It wasn't as if Ms. Carter was overtly cruel, rather, she seemed to be gradually tightening her grip as though testing the boundaries, watching for signs of resistance. Emma felt the weight of that scrutiny every time their eyes met, felt the sharpness in the teacher's gaze, the unspoken demand to perform. Ms. Carter started to call on Emma more frequently in class, asking questions that were slightly more challenging than those directed at her peers. At first, it seemed innocuous, a way of keeping the class engaged perhaps, but Emma soon realized it was deliberate. Every time she stuttered, every time she failed to give a satisfactory answer, Ms. Carter's look grew colder, more dismissive. The other students, aware of the tension, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats when Emma was called on. No one came to her defense. Instead, they watched with bated breath, as though waiting for her to fail. One day, Ms. Carter asked Emma to stay after class. The rest of the students filed out, chatting among themselves, but Emma remained seated, her palms sweaty against her desk. Her heart raced as she watched Ms. Carter collect papers at the front of the room, her movements precise, almost mechanical. There was no friendly smile, no comforting words. When Ms. Carter finally turned to face her, the teacher's gaze was distant, almost clinical. "Emma," she said, her voice low and controlled, "I've noticed your work slipping. You're capable of more than this." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She hadn't realized her grades were slipping so badly. She hadn't realized she was falling behind until it had been pointed out in this way. The weight of the teacher's judgment felt suffocating. "I need you to step it up," Ms. Carter continued, her tone cool but firm. "You've been distracted lately. And if you don't get your act together, I'm going to have to take further action." Emma nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She couldn't tell if this was a threat or just the teacher's way of expressing frustration, but the intensity of her gaze made it feel like the former. When Emma left the classroom that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slowly closing in around her. Ms. Carter's words had an unsettling finality to them. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about control. The teacher was tightening her grip, each move calculated, and Emma felt herself slipping further from her grasp. The subtle aggression continued over the next few weeks. Ms. Carter began to pick apart Emma's every move. Even the smallest mistakes now seemed like signs of incompetence. In group work, Emma was always assigned the tasks that required the least amount of responsibility, never given the opportunity to lead, never trusted to make decisions. Instead, she was constantly watched, her every effort scrutinized. It wasn't overtly hostile, but the weight of it was unbearable. Each glance, each correction felt like a jab, a reminder that she was not performing to the teacher's standard. During a class discussion on a particularly difficult topic, Ms. Carter singled Emma out again. Emma had hesitated before answering, unsure of the right terminology to use, and Ms. Carter didn't miss the hesitation. "Emma, you're thinking too hard," Ms. Carter remarked sharply, the words cutting through the conversation. "It's simple. You're overcomplicating it. Maybe you need to spend some extra time after school working on this." Emma's cheeks burned. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, their discomfort palpable. The pressure was suffocating, and yet, there was no escape. The power imbalance between them was growing clearer with each passing day. Ms. Carter's actions, though subtle, were building a wall between her and Emma. What had once been an ordinary student-teacher dynamic was now a battle for dominance, one in which Emma had no say, no control. The power that Ms. Carter wielded was like a shadow, creeping into every corner of their relationship, leaving Emma to wonder just how far her teacher would go to maintain it. Each day, Emma's shoulders grew heavier, as though an invisible weight had settled upon her chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. She couldn't escape the feeling of being trapped under Ms. Carter's watchful gaze. The teacher's subtle aggression had escalated over the past few weeks, leaving Emma on edge, unsure of how to navigate the classroom without drawing unwanted attention. It was as though she had become the target of some unspoken test, a test of her endurance, her ability to withstand the constant pressure and scrutiny without cracking. And with each passing day, Emma felt more and more like she was reaching her breaking point. The constant cycle of doubt, fear, and self-recrimination had become exhausting. Emma had always been a quiet student, someone who kept to herself and avoided confrontation. But now, she was no longer able to bury her unease. Every time Ms. Carter's voice cut through the classroom, every time she was singled out in front of her peers, Emma's anxiety spiked. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt truly confident, truly free to speak her mind without fear of judgment. Her thoughts, once sharp and clear, were now muddled by a constant hum of insecurity. The whispers of doubt that had been creeping into her mind for weeks now began to form more clearly. Was she really so bad? Had she done something to deserve this? Every action, every word, seemed to be scrutinized with a level of intensity that left Emma questioning herself at every turn. She had always been a diligent student, always tried her best to keep up with the work, but now it felt like that wasn't enough. It was as if no matter what she did, she could never meet Ms. Carter's expectations, and that realization sent a wave of helplessness crashing over her. At lunch one day, Emma found herself sitting in the corner of the cafeteria, absent-mindedly picking at her sandwich, her mind racing. Her friends were chatting nearby, but Emma couldn't focus on their conversations. Her thoughts were consumed with the classroom, the constant tension with Ms. Carter. She could still hear the teacher's voice in her head, reprimanding her, criticizing her, making her feel small. The feeling of being trapped, the sense that there was no way out, was suffocating. She looked up from her food and saw her best friend, Lily, walking toward her. Lily had been noticing the change in Emma, the way she had withdrawn from the group, the way her usually bright smile had faded into something more guarded. "Hey," Lily said, sitting down across from her. "You okay? You haven't been yourself lately." Emma forced a smile, the same smile she had been offering for weeks now, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just tired." Lily raised an eyebrow. "You sure? You've been acting different. Like you're carrying a lot of weight on your shoulders. Is something going on with Miss Carter? You've mentioned her a couple of times." Emma's heart skipped a beat. How could she explain what was happening? How could she put into words the suffocating pressure, the feeling of being cornered by her own teacher? She had been hesitant to talk about it, unsure of how to even begin, or if anyone would believe her. "I don't know," Emma said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, she's been really hard on me lately. I don't think I'm doing anything wrong, but she keeps singling me out. I can't do anything right in her eyes." Lily frowned. "That doesn't sound like her. Are you sure you're just not reading too much into it?" Emma shook her head. "No, Lily. It's not just that. She's been getting really mean, I guess. The things she says, the way she looks at me. It feels like she's trying to make me mess up, like she wants to catch me doing something wrong. I don't know if I can take it much longer." Lily's expression softened, but there was concern in her eyes. "Have you thought about talking to someone? Like, maybe another teacher, or even the principal? I mean, I don't want to tell you what to do, but it doesn't seem right that she's treating you this way." Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had thought about it, but the idea of speaking up seemed both impossible and terrifying. The weight of Ms. Carter's power over her was suffocating, and the thought of confronting it head-on made her stomach turn. What if no one believed her? What if she was overreacting, making a bigger deal out of it than it really was? She had always prided herself on keeping a low profile, on being the quiet, unnoticed student who stayed out of trouble. If she spoke out now, it would draw attention she didn't want, attention that could turn everything upside down. "I don't know," Emma said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to make things worse. I'm just trying to get through the year. I don't want to make a scene, but it feels like something's not right." Lily nodded, her eyes full of understanding, though there was a touch of sadness in them as well. "I get it, Emma. It's scary. But sometimes, you can't just wait for it to get better on its own. You don't deserve to feel this way. If you ever want to talk, or if you decide you want to do something about it, I'll be here." Emma nodded, feeling a swell of emotion rise in her chest. She didn't know what the right answer was. She didn't know how to fix it, or even if she could. But for the first time in weeks, the idea of speaking out, of reaching out for help, didn't seem quite as impossible as it had before. Maybe she wasn't as alone in this as she had thought. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Emma's mind raced. The fear of confrontation was still there, gnawing at her, but so was the flicker of determination. She knew something had to change. But whether she would find the strength to confront Ms. Carter, to speak up, was still uncertain. The next move was hers, but for now, it felt like she was standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure of whether to leap. The classroom had become an oppressive space for Emma. Every day felt like a silent battle, one she didn't know how to fight. Ms. Carter's continued scrutiny, her thinly veiled hostility, and the coldness that seemed to grow with each passing moment were impossible to ignore. But the strangest part was that no one seemed to acknowledge what was happening. No one spoke up. No one asked if Emma was okay. And yet, there were subtle signs that her classmates, even some of the other teachers, were starting to notice the shift. It began in small ways. A glance exchanged between Mark and Lily when Ms. Carter raised her voice a little too sharply toward Emma during class discussions. The way Emma's classmates seemed to stiffen when the teacher singled her out yet again. They were aware, but no one said a word. It was as though they were all watching a slow-motion car crash, powerless to do anything but stare. Mark, Emma's former ally in group projects, sat next to her during one of the assignments where Ms. Carter had given Emma a series of particularly difficult questions to answer. Emma's hands were trembling, and Mark could feel the tension radiating off her. He had noticed how Ms. Carter's voice had taken on that sharp, almost mocking tone when Emma hesitated, how the teacher's eyes never seemed to leave her. Mark's stomach churned with discomfort, but he did nothing. At lunch, he and Lily exchanged a few words, but neither of them mentioned Emma's ongoing tension with Ms. Carter. They didn't need to. It was clear that something was wrong, but it was easier not to talk about it. Mark had always been the type to keep his head down and avoid trouble. The last thing he wanted was to get involved in something that might make him the target of Ms. Carter's growing ire. "Did you see how she looked at Emma today?" Lily had whispered as they walked away from the cafeteria, careful not to attract attention. "It's like she's waiting for her to screw up." Mark didn't respond immediately. He knew exactly what Lily meant. But what was there to say? It wasn't like they could do anything. Emma hadn't said anything to them directly. She hadn't asked for help, hadn't even hinted that she wanted them to intervene. What if they were wrong? What if Emma was just overreacting? Besides, how could they possibly stand up to a teacher like Ms. Carter, who held all the power? The most anyone would do was exchange a few uneasy glances during class, but that was it. No one spoke out, no one asked if Emma was all right. In one particular class, Emma was sitting quietly at her desk, trying her best to focus on the lesson, but Ms. Carter had once again turned her attention toward her. Emma could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, and the growing discomfort in the room was palpable. Ms. Carter's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. I'm waiting. What's the answer?" The question wasn't that difficult, but Emma froze. She hadn't been paying attention. Her thoughts were consumed by the relentless pressure she'd been under in the past few weeks. Her eyes darted to the clock, counting down the seconds. Her mind went blank. A ripple of unease passed through the room as the silence stretched on. Mark glanced at Lily, his eyes full of concern, but neither of them spoke. The others, who were all seated in their desks, glanced between each other in awkward silence. They had all noticed it, the way Miss Carter had been singling Emma out, the way she seemed to delight in pushing her to the breaking point. But no one said anything. No one stood up for Emma. Ms. Carter's expression remained unchanged. "Well, I guess we'll have to go over this again tomorrow, then." There was a pause before she moved on, but the damage was already done. Emma's face burned with humiliation, the weight of the unspoken judgment heavier than anything the teacher had said. She had been exposed, vulnerable, left to falter in front of her peers, and yet not a single one of them had offered her even the slightest support. The worst part was that it wasn't just the students who were complicit in this passive behavior. The other teachers had also begun to notice, although their reactions were no less passive. Ms. Jackson, the teacher next door, had always been a friendly face, always quick to greet students in the hallways with a smile. But for the past few weeks, Emma had noticed that Ms. Jackson's greetings had become more distant, her smiles colder. She had caught Ms. Jackson watching the classroom interaction between Ms. Carter and Emma once. Her eyes narrowed in thought, but she never spoke up. Even Principal Harris, who was known for being an advocate for students, had stopped by Ms. Carter's class a few times. Emma had seen him glance in her direction, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary, but he never asked if everything was okay. He never pulled Emma aside to check in with her. Emma could feel it, this growing sense of isolation. It wasn't just the silence from her classmates. It was the growing realization that no one in authority, not even the adults who were supposed to protect her, were willing to step in. The system was silent, and Emma was beginning to understand how dangerous silence could be. It wasn't that anyone was actively cruel. No one outright sided with Ms. Carter's behavior or condoned her treatment of Emma. But the lack of intervention, the failure to even acknowledge the growing tension in the classroom, was almost worse. They were all complicit in the silence. And Emma, feeling more and more like a pawn in a game she couldn't control, began to wonder if anyone would ever have the courage to stand up. Would they only act once it was too late? Or would they keep turning a blind eye, pretending everything was fine, as long as it didn't directly affect them? The classroom had been building to this moment for weeks, the tension thick in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Ms. Carter's simmering hostility toward Emma had grown more intense, her authority more unyielding, until there was no longer any room for doubt. Something was going to happen, something that would shatter the delicate balance between them, and that moment arrived with an explosive confrontation. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the sun low in the sky and casting long shadows across the classroom. The lesson had been dull, the sound of chalk on the board scraping through the still air, but Emma couldn't focus. Her eyes were fixed on the clock, her mind elsewhere, wondering if today would be the day when it all came to a head. Miss Carter was at her desk, flipping through papers, but her eyes kept darting to Emma. There was something in her gaze, something unsettling. It was the same cold, assessing look she had worn for the past few weeks, as though she were waiting for Emma to make a mistake, to slip up so she could pounce. And Emma, already worn thin by the pressure, could feel the weight of it bearing down on her. Her hands were clammy, her stomach churned with anxiety. She tried to focus on her notes, but the words blurred in front of her. And then it happened. Ms. Carter called her name, her voice sharp, like a whip cracking through the silence. "Emma, I've asked you twice already. Do you have the answer to this question or not?" The class went still. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward Emma, and the sound of the ticking clock filled the silence. Emma's heart hammered in her chest. She had been trying to solve the problem, but her mind had gone blank, the numbers and words twisting into meaningless shapes. She could feel the blood rushing to her face, her ears ringing, but she couldn't speak, couldn't form the words. Ms. Carter stood up from her desk, her movements slow and deliberate. The click of her heels against the floor seemed to echo louder than the words that followed. "Why do you always do this, Emma?" Ms. Carter's voice was quieter now, but the tension in her tone made it all the more chilling. "Why do you always act like you don't care about this class? You think I don't notice? You think I don't know you're not even trying?" The entire class was frozen. Emma could feel the eyes of her classmates burning into her, but all she could focus on was the teacher, whose words were growing more cutting, more personal with each passing second. "I'm not stupid, Emma," Ms. Carter continued, stepping closer to her desk, now towering over Emma's seated form. "I can see right through you. You're lazy. You don't belong here. And the worst part is you think you're entitled to this education. You think you deserve the same chances as everyone else. Well, guess what? You don't. You've had every opportunity, and yet you squander it. It's pathetic." The room was thick with the weight of her words. Emma could feel her chest tighten as if someone had wrapped a vice around her ribcage. The humiliation burned hotter than anything physical, but worse than that was the utter cruelty behind Ms. Carter's words. Emma wanted to say something, to defend herself, to explain that she had been trying her best, but the words wouldn't come. Every ounce of her energy was drained, and all that remained was a raw, exposed feeling of being completely powerless. Ms. Carter's eyes bored into her. "You should be ashamed of yourself. How do you think it feels to have someone like you in my class, wasting my time? I have a reputation to uphold. I don't have time for students who don't even care enough to try." Emma's eyes stung with unshed tears, and the room seemed to shrink around her. Her classmates were watching, but no one moved. No one intervened. She felt as though she was suffocating under the weight of their gaze, her breath coming in shallow gasps as Ms. Carter's words continued to slice through her, each one deeper than the last. And then it happened. In a moment of sheer desperation, Emma's emotions erupted. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. She was shaking, her heart racing as the tears finally spilled over. "I'm trying," she shouted, the words tumbling out in a jagged, panicked burst. "I'm trying so hard, but you just keep pushing me down, and I don't know what you want from me anymore." The room seemed to hold its breath. Emma's voice trembled with the weight of everything she had been holding inside. Her fear, her frustration, the helplessness that had been building for weeks. The outburst was not just the culmination of the tension with Ms. Carter, but of everything she had been struggling with in the classroom, in her life, in herself. Ms. Carter's face twisted with something darker now, a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "Don't raise your voice at me, young lady," she snapped, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Who do you think you are?" But Emma wasn't backing down. Her emotions had taken control, and she couldn't stop herself anymore. "You don't understand. You don't get it," she cried, the words flooding out as though they had been trapped inside her for far too long. "You're not trying to help me, you're just tearing me apart. Why are you doing this to me? What did I do wrong?" For a moment, the entire classroom seemed frozen in place, the only sound the harsh, uneven breaths that Emma struggled to control. Her face was flushed with emotion, her chest rising and falling in rapid succession. She had reached her breaking point. Ms. Carter stood silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. The rest of the class was still and quiet, each student waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. No one spoke. No one stepped in. Then, as if snapping back into control, Ms. Carter straightened, her features hardening once more. "Sit down, Emma," she said coldly. No. Emma, still trembling, felt a mix of exhaustion and defiance course through her. She sank back into her chair, her face burning with embarrassment, but there was something else, something powerful, something that hadn't been there before. She had spoken out. She had let it all out. But the damage was done. The explosive eruption of emotion had shattered the illusion of control that Ms. Carter had held over her, and the classroom would never be the same again. Whether it would lead to the change Emma hoped for, or something worse, no one could say. The only thing Emma knew for sure was that she had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The classroom was still, the only sound the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The tension between Emma and Ms. Carter hung thick in the air, suffocating everything around them. The teacher's cruel words still echoed in Emma's mind, reverberating in a cycle of shame and self-doubt. But now that the outburst had passed, Emma's body seemed to go into autopilot, numb, detached from everything happening around her. The storm had passed, but the aftermath was far from over. Emma sat there, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, as if holding on to something, anything, to keep herself from falling apart. The tears that had welled up in her eyes were now gone, replaced by a cold emptiness that spread throughout her chest. Her breathing had slowed, but her heart felt as though it was caught in a vice, squeezed tight with fear and frustration. There was no turning back from what had just happened. The damage was done. Ms. Carter had resumed the lesson as though nothing had occurred. She moved briskly across the room, writing on the board, speaking in a monotone that seemed to float above Emma's head, never quite reaching her. The other students seemed as though they were in a trance, unsure of what to do, but none of them dared to break the silence. Some pretended to focus on their work, others glanced at Emma nervously, but no one said anything. They were all too afraid to speak up, too afraid to make a move. Emma could feel their eyes on her, but it didn't matter anymore. There was no escaping this feeling. The isolation, the loneliness, the sense that she was utterly powerless in this space. It was as if she were trapped in a glass box, watching the world go on around her, but unable to participate. No one would help her, and even if they did, she didn't know if it would matter. She had crossed a line with Ms. Carter, and there was no going back. As the minutes dragged on, Emma's mind wandered back to the fight. The anger in her voice had startled her. She had never raised her voice like that before, never let herself be so raw, so exposed. But in that moment, she had felt something shift inside her. A crack in the armor she had built over the years. It had been fleeting, but it was there. A flicker of defiance, of resistance, like a small ember in the dark. But now, as she sat in the classroom, she could feel that ember dimming, extinguished by the crushing weight of reality. What had she accomplished? What had she proven? Had she truly said anything meaningful, or had she just added fuel to the fire? She didn't know. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. Her eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. It was nearly time for the bell to ring, signaling the end of the class. She couldn't wait to leave, to escape the suffocating walls of the classroom and the relentless gaze of her classmates. But even as she counted down the seconds, a part of her feared the finality of it all. What would happen once the bell rang? Would Ms. Carter speak to her after class? Would she tell her parents? Would she find a way to make Emma's life even more unbearable? Suddenly, Emma felt the weight of the classroom bear down on her again. The sheer exhaustion of the emotional toll she had been under for weeks, the constant fear, the anxiety, the pressure, was catching up with her. It wasn't just Ms. Carter's cruelty that had drained her. It was everything. The isolation she felt at school, the pressure to be perfect, the uncertainty about her future. Every expectation, every criticism, every failure, it all piled up inside her, a mountain of unresolved emotions that she had never known how to deal with. In that moment, something inside her snapped. It wasn't an explosion of anger like the one before. It was quieter, more internal. But it was no less powerful. It was the overwhelming sense that she had been fighting a losing battle all along. That maybe she wasn't enough. That no matter how hard she tried, she would never be able to meet everyone's expectations. That her worth was always going to be measured by someone else's standards, and no matter how much she gave, it would never be enough. The bell rang, signaling the end of the class, but Emma didn't move. She remained seated, her body rigid with exhaustion, her mind spinning in a whirlpool of self-doubt. She heard the shuffle of feet as the other students filed out of the room, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. She didn't know where to go or what to do with herself. She had never felt so small, so insignificant. Ms. Carter's voice broke through the silence. Emma. The teacher's tone was cold, matter-of-fact, but there was an underlying edge to it. Emma didn't look up. She couldn't look at her. She didn't want to face her again, to feel the weight of her judgment pressing down on her. But she knew she couldn't escape this. Not yet. Come here, Ms. Carter's voice commanded. Emma stood up slowly, her legs shaky beneath her, her heart hammering in her chest. She made her way to the front of the classroom, her movements mechanical, her mind numb. When she reached Ms. Carter's desk, she stood silently, not meeting the teacher's gaze. Her heart raced with a mixture of dread and resignation. She was going to be punished, scolded, or worse. Ms. Carter didn't speak right away. She simply looked at Emma with a sharp, calculating gaze, as though weighing something inside her. The silence stretched on, and Emma stood there, her shoulders hunched, trying to hold herself together. She felt utterly broken, exposed. She had reached the breaking point. Sit, Ms. Carter finally said, gesturing to the chair next to her desk. Emma sank into the chair, her body heavy with fatigue. She couldn't bring herself to say anything. What could she say? What was there to say anymore? She had already done everything she could to hold it together, to make sense of the chaos. But now, she realized, there was nothing left. Ms. Carter leaned in slightly, her voice low but firm. You think that kind of behavior is acceptable? You think you can just shout at me in front of the whole class and get away with it? Emma's throat tightened, but she said nothing. She couldn't. Her voice felt as though it had been stolen from her, replaced with a hollow, empty feeling that she couldn't shake. Ms. Carter's gaze softened slightly, though the underlying judgment remained. You need to understand that in this world, not everyone is going to coddle you. Not everyone is going to protect you when you screw up. Emma wanted to respond, wanted to fight back, but she couldn't find the words. She couldn't summon the energy to challenge Ms. Carter's cold words. The silence between them was deafening. Finally, Ms. Carter stood up, straightening her posture. Don't think this is over, Emma. You and I will be having a very different conversation soon. Emma nodded numbly, her heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. She stood up to leave, but as she walked to the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something deep inside her had shifted. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that classroom at the start of the day. The silence between Emma and Ms. Carter lingered as Emma slowly turned to leave the classroom. Her mind was numb from the barrage of emotions, the shock of the confrontation, and the deep, gnawing sense that things would never be the same again. But as she reached the door, she heard Ms. Carter speak, her voice lower, quieter than before, almost as if she was sharing something personal. Do you know why I became a teacher, Emma? The question hung in the air, unexpected, disorienting. Emma froze at the door, her hand on the doorknob, unsure if she should turn around. Was this another psychological game? Another attempt to control, to dominate? But something in the way Ms. Carter spoke made Emma hesitate. It wasn't the usual coldness, nor the harshness of the teacher's earlier demeanor. There was something softer, almost vulnerable in her voice. It was a sharp contrast to the anger Emma had felt moments before. Emma didn't answer. She didn't know how to answer. Was this another trap? Was Ms. Carter trying to manipulate her emotions again? Ms. Carter's gaze softened as she stood up, walking slowly toward Emma, her movements deliberate, almost cautious. You know, I didn't always want to be a teacher, she continued, her tone almost wistful now, a sharp break from the authoritative voice that had commanded the room only moments ago. Emma didn't move. Her curiosity was piqued, but she didn't know if she could trust the shift in Ms. Carter's behavior. I grew up in a family that didn't value education, Ms. Carter said, her voice quiet but steady. My parents, they didn't have the time for me. They didn't care about my grades or my future. I was invisible, always trying to earn their love, their approval, always trying to be good enough. Her words hit Emma like a wave crashing on the shore. The air in the room seemed to change, the tension thickening as the teacher opened up in a way Emma hadn't expected. Ms. Carter was revealing something about herself, something that wasn't just about power, authority, or her role as a teacher. It was something personal, something buried deep beneath the cold, unapproachable exterior. I worked so hard to prove myself, Ms. Carter continued, her gaze focused on the floor now, almost as if the memories she was reliving were too painful to confront directly. But no matter how hard I tried, nothing was ever good enough. My parents just never saw me. And when I became a teacher, I thought I could make up for everything I had lost. I could be the authority that I never had. I could give students the structure they needed to succeed. She paused, and Emma, despite her better judgment, found herself drawn into the teacher's vulnerability. Was this the same Ms. Carter who had humiliated her in front of the class? The same woman who had wielded her power with such cold precision? How could this person be the same as the one who had reduced Emma to tears? But Ms. Carter's voice faltered, and Emma noticed the brief hesitation. She was battling with something, maybe with herself. But it became more than just helping students. I started to crave control. I began to feel like I needed to control them, make them conform, because that's the only way I felt like I could earn respect. I've become someone I don't even recognize sometimes. Emma felt a strange sympathy stir within her, even as she felt the raw sting of everything that had happened in the classroom. Could it be that Ms. Carter wasn't just the villain in this story? Could there be a part of her that was also a victim? Was she so consumed by her past hurts that she couldn't see the harm she was doing? I'm not proud of what I've become, Ms. Carter whispered, her voice barely audible now, as though she was speaking more to herself than to Emma. I'm not proud of how I treat my students, how I make them feel small, how I make them feel like they have to fight for every little bit of recognition. But sometimes, Emma, when you've been ignored your whole life, you don't know how to stop yourself. You don't know how to let go of the need for power." Emma stood there, frozen, her mind whirling. Was this a confession? Was this the truth behind the woman who had pushed her to her breaking point? She had never considered that Ms. Carter might have been fighting her own demons. And yet, now that she heard it, it almost made sense. The cruelty, the harsh discipline. It wasn't just a desire to control. It was an attempt to hold on to something, to fix something broken inside herself. But Emma couldn't just forget what had happened. She couldn't ignore the fact that Ms. Carter's actions had left deep scars on her confidence, on her sense of worth. This wasn't a moment of redemption, nor an invitation to feel pity. It was a moment of revelation. And in the midst of it, Emma realized that the teacher was just as lost, just as broken as any of her students. "Why are you telling me this now?" Emma asked, her voice trembling with confusion and a touch of anger. "Why now, after everything you've done?" Ms. Carter lifted her head, her eyes meeting Emma's for the first time since the confrontation. The anger was gone from her expression, replaced by something far more unsettling: vulnerability. For a moment, she seemed almost human. Not the distant, untouchable authority figure, but a woman who had been scarred by her own experiences, someone who was trying, desperately, to make sense of it all. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Emma," Ms. Carter said softly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. But maybe, just maybe, you'll understand that I never meant to hurt you. I just didn't know any other way." The room seemed to close in on Emma as the weight of her words sank in. It was a revelation she hadn't anticipated, and it unsettled her more than any of Ms. Carter's earlier harshness had. Was this the same person who had humiliated her, who had made her feel powerless and small? Was this the same woman who had pushed her to the edge of her own emotional limits? Emma didn't know how to respond. She felt a mixture of disbelief and sympathy, but it didn't erase the pain that still lingered inside her. It didn't make everything that had happened okay. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, before turning away from Ms. Carter, her mind still reeling from the unexpected turn of events. She didn't say a word as she walked out of the classroom, the door clicking shut behind her. But as she stepped into the hallway, Emma realized something that she hadn't known before. This wasn't just a story about one teacher and one student. This was a story about the wounds we carry, the ways we hurt each other, and the complicated, messy journey of trying to understand ourselves and others. And though Emma still wasn't sure what would happen next, one thing was certain: things were never going to be the same again. The next day at school, the atmosphere was different. It was as though a storm had passed through the halls, leaving behind a heavy, lingering quiet. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted. What had happened in Ms. Carter's classroom the day before was no longer a secret. The whispers had already started. Emma's heart pounded as she walked down the hallway, still feeling the weight of the confrontation that had unfolded just hours ago. She could still hear Ms. Carter's words echoing in her head, the vulnerability in her voice that had shattered the cold, authoritative facade. But she didn't know what to do with that. She didn't know how to reconcile the teacher's confession with the emotional scars she had left on Emma and others in the class. As she passed the student lounge, she overheard a conversation that made her stop in her tracks. "I can't believe she would do that," a voice whispered, barely audible. "Ms. Carter was always so tough, but I never thought she'd cross the line like that." Another voice chimed in. "I heard she's been reported. People are talking about what she did to Emma. The principal's involved now." The words stung, but Emma kept walking, her mind racing. She wasn't the only one who had been affected. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had felt the weight of Ms. Carter's authority. The students who had been too scared to speak out. The ones who had quietly endured her manipulations, her demands, her cruelty. When Emma finally made it to her first class of the day, she could see the ripple effect all around her. Her classmates were acting differently, avoiding eye contact, speaking in hushed tones. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. She had been the one to bring the teacher's actions into the light, but now, it felt like the whole school was watching her. It was as though she had become the symbol of something much bigger than herself, something that had to be addressed, even if no one truly understood the depth of the situation. It didn't take long for word to spread. The principal called an emergency assembly, addressing the entire school with a stern, unwavering tone. There was no mention of Emma by name, but the atmosphere in the auditorium was thick with anticipation. Every student knew exactly why they were there. As of today, the principal began, there have been serious allegations brought against one of our teachers, Ms. Carter. We take matters of abuse and misconduct very seriously, and we are conducting a thorough investigation into the situation. Ms. Carter has been placed on administrative leave pending the results of this inquiry. Emma could hardly breathe as the principal's words washed over the room. The teacher who had ruled the classroom with an iron fist, the one who had made her feel so small, was now the subject of scrutiny. The power had shifted, and the woman who had once held the reins of control was now vulnerable, exposed, just like she had made Emma feel. But Emma wasn't sure if she felt satisfaction or something else entirely. The emotions were too tangled, too raw to make sense of. After the assembly, Emma was approached by a few of her classmates, their faces full of mixed emotions. Some seemed relieved, as though a weight had been lifted. Others, however, looked uncomfortable, unsure of how to react. "I'm sorry for what happened," one girl, Sarah, said softly, her eyes filled with empathy. "I didn't realize how bad it was. We all thought Miss Carter was just tough, you know? But I had no idea she was crossing the line like that." Emma didn't know what to say. There was a part of her that wanted to tell them everything, that she felt conflicted, torn between the teacher's vulnerability and the way she had hurt Emma and others. But she stayed silent, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. The truth was, she didn't need their sympathy. She needed time. Time to process everything. Time to figure out how to move forward after the storm that had swept through her life. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, investigations, and tense conversations between students, teachers, and administrators. Ms. Carter was nowhere to be found. Her office, once a place of stern authority, stood empty. And as the investigation unfolded, more students came forward with their stories, each revealing their own encounters with the teacher's overbearing presence. The weight of her actions finally became clear to everyone, even to those who had once seen Ms. Carter as an unapproachable authority figure. No one had expected her to break. No one had expected her to fall from grace. But the cracks in her carefully constructed world were undeniable. The students who had been subjected to her cruelty were now finding their voices. They were no longer afraid to speak out. For Emma, the aftermath of the confrontation was bittersweet. She had brought the truth to light, but the consequences were far-reaching, affecting not only Ms. Carter's career but also her own sense of self. She had fought for her voice, and in doing so, she had sparked a movement that rippled through the school. But as Emma walked through the hallways in the days that followed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost in the process. Yes, Ms. Carter had been held accountable, but what about the emotional scars that lingered? What about the students who had suffered silently for so long? Would they ever truly heal? It was clear that there were no simple answers. The consequences for Ms. Carter had been swift, but the real journey was just beginning, for everyone involved. And as Emma continued to navigate the aftermath, she couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of real change, or just another chapter in the endless cycle of power, abuse, and silence? The days after the assembly were a blur for Emma. Everything had changed, but nothing had really shifted. She could feel it in the way people looked at her, some with pity, others with curiosity, and a few with quiet admiration. The whispers still followed her through the hallways, and it was almost as if the entire school was watching her every move. Yet despite the attention, Emma couldn't escape the feeling that she was still drowning in the aftermath of everything that had happened. She wasn't sure what she had expected, maybe for everything to return to normal, or for the weight of Ms. Carter's actions to somehow vanish in the wake of the investigation. But healing wasn't something that happened overnight, and the scars that had formed over months of manipulation, intimidation, and power plays weren't going to fade so easily. In the quiet moments, when the bustle of school life paused for just a second, Emma would find herself staring at her reflection in the mirror, searching for something she couldn't quite put into words. Who was she now? The girl who had been humiliated in front of her classmates? The one who had been made to feel invisible and small? Or was she something more? The one who had found her voice and stood up to the teacher who had tried to control her? It wasn't easy. In fact, It was one of the hardest things she had ever done. There were days when she couldn't bring herself to step into the classroom, when the weight of everything she had endured threatened to crush her spirit. The fear that had once paralyzed her was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. The same fear that had kept her silent for so long, silent in the face of Ms. Carter's harsh words, her manipulative tactics, her subtle aggression, now tried to creep back into her life. It whispered that she wasn't strong enough, that she wasn't worth standing up for. But something inside Emma began to shift. She realized that her silence had only fed the cycle. Every time she had held back, every time she had taken another insult, another punishment without speaking out, she had allowed the power imbalance to grow. And now, with the truth coming to light, she wasn't just a victim in the story. She was the catalyst for change. The journey wasn't easy, but Emma began to heal in small ways. Each day, she woke up with a little more courage. When she saw her classmates, she would hold her head a little higher. She didn't need their pity, nor their validation. She was learning to validate herself. One afternoon, during a meeting with the counselor, Emma found herself speaking more freely than she had in weeks. It wasn't a groundbreaking revelation, nor was it a moment of total healing. But it was progress. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't hiding behind her fears. She wasn't hiding from her truth. "I'm still scared," Emma admitted quietly, her voice soft but steady. "But I'm not going to let that fear control me anymore. I have a right to stand up for myself. I have a right to be heard." The counselor nodded, a gentle smile of approval crossing her face. "You're finding your strength, Emma. That's the first step toward healing." And in that moment, Emma realized something profound. Healing wasn't a destination. It wasn't something that would come all at once. It was a journey, and she had already taken the most important step, acknowledging that she had the power to reclaim her voice. As the days turned into weeks, Emma started to speak up more in class. Not just about Ms. Carter's actions, but about her own thoughts, her own ideas. It wasn't about being loud or demanding attention. It was about asserting herself, about not allowing anyone to diminish her worth. Her confidence grew, not because she was suddenly invincible, but because she had learned to embrace her vulnerability and transform it into strength. Emma didn't know what would happen with Ms. Carter. She didn't know what the future held or whether things would ever truly feel normal again. But what she did know was this: she had found something within herself that could never be taken away. She had found her voice, and no one could silence it again. The fallout from the incident spread beyond the walls of the school, reaching the local community in ways no one could have predicted. For weeks, Emma became the center of whispered conversations, both supportive and skeptical. Teachers, parents, and students all had their own opinions about what had happened, but one thing was clear: the incident had left a mark on the entire community, revealing fractures that had long been hidden beneath the surface. At school, the reaction was mixed. In the immediate aftermath, there was an outpouring of support for Emma. Many students admired her courage for speaking out. Classmates who had been silent for years now came forward, sharing their own stories of how Ms. Carter's methods had crossed the line. The emotional toll of living in fear of a teacher's overbearing authority was finally being acknowledged, and Emma's actions had opened the door for others to step into the light. But not everyone saw it that way. Some students were uncomfortable with how things had played out. They had grown up with Ms. Carter as a figure of discipline, a strict teacher who demanded respect and worked to push them to achieve. They didn't understand why her methods, which they considered tough but fair, had now been labeled as abusive. There were murmurs in the halls about Emma's role in bringing her down, with some even suggesting that she had overreacted. These students still clung to the belief that authority should be unquestioned, that teachers were infallible. In their eyes, Emma had upset the delicate balance of power within the classroom, and that disturbed them. Among the teachers, the reaction was equally divided. Some were quietly relieved that the issue had been exposed. They had seen the signs of Ms. Carter's aggression for years but hadn't felt empowered to intervene. Now, they finally had the support to address the broader issue of abusive power dynamics in the classroom. Others, however, were uncomfortable with the idea that their colleagues were being scrutinized so publicly. They had known Ms. Carter as someone who had always been fiercely protective of her students, even if her methods were unorthodox. They feared that the incident could tarnish the reputation of the entire teaching staff and create a climate of distrust. In the broader community, the response was polarized. On one side, there were parents and local organizations that rallied behind Emma, praising her bravery in speaking up. They saw her as a symbol of resilience and a catalyst for change, someone who had defied the status quo to right a wrong. They rallied for reforms in the school system, pushing for more oversight in classrooms and better training for teachers on how to handle power dynamics and student relationships. On the other side, there were voices of dissent, including some parents who viewed the incident as an overreaction. They questioned whether it was appropriate for a single student to bring such serious allegations against a teacher, a figure who had spent years working hard to educate and shape young minds. They expressed concern that the public nature of the allegations would undermine respect for authority, not just in schools but in society at large. In their eyes, Emma's actions could have set a dangerous precedent, one that encouraged students to challenge authority without understanding the full context. Local media outlets picked up the story, further fueling the debate. News reports covered the ongoing investigation into Ms. Carter's behavior, while opinion pieces highlighted the broader issue of teacher accountability. Some articles framed the incident as a triumph for student rights, while others decried the erosion of authority in the classroom. As the dust began to settle, Emma found herself overwhelmed by the weight of it all. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she had become a symbol, and with that came both praise and criticism. But amid the noise, Emma realized something important. It wasn't about what the community thought of her. It was about the changes that had been set in motion. She had taken a stand, and others had joined her. And though the journey was far from over, she was no longer just a passive bystander in her own story. She was an active participant in a broader movement for accountability and change. As the weeks passed, the storm surrounding Emma and Ms. Carter began to settle. The investigation had concluded, and the consequences were now clear. Ms. Carter was placed on administrative leave, pending a thorough review of her conduct. The school had promised changes, more stringent protocols for teacher-student interactions, additional training for staff, and a commitment to fostering an environment where students felt safe to speak out against any form of abuse. Yet, despite the external changes, it was the internal transformation that mattered most to Emma. The weight that had been pressing down on her shoulders, the constant anxiety of navigating a classroom where she felt small and powerless, began to lift. The fear that had clung to her for so long was still present, but it no longer controlled her. Emma had come to realize that closure wasn't about forgetting what had happened or erasing the emotional scars. It was about accepting them, learning from them, and growing stronger in spite of them. In the days that followed, Emma returned to her classes with a sense of purpose. She wasn't the same quiet, uncertain girl who had been too afraid to speak up. She now sat taller, her gaze steady, no longer shying away from confrontation or difficult conversations. Her classmates began to notice, some with admiration, others with a quiet recognition that they, too, had the power to speak their truth if they chose to. But even more significant was the change in Emma's relationship with her own voice. The internal dialogue that had once whispered that she wasn't strong enough, that she wasn't worthy of standing up for herself, began to fade. In its place was a new, empowering narrative, one that reminded her that her experiences, no matter how painful, were valid. Her journey was her own, and it didn't need to be defined by someone else's perception of her worth. The final act of closure came when Emma spoke at the school assembly, addressing her peers and teachers about what she had learned throughout this ordeal. The gymnasium was filled with quiet anticipation as Emma walked to the microphone. She didn't speak of Ms. Carter's misdeeds directly. Instead, she focused on the broader message, the importance of respecting one another's boundaries, of understanding that authority carries responsibility, and that silence in the face of injustice was a choice. Standing up doesn't always mean speaking loudly or being the first to act, Emma said, her voice clear and steady. Sometimes, it's simply about refusing to let fear dictate your actions. It's about finding your strength, no matter how small or quiet it may seem. Her words hung in the air as the audience sat in stillness, reflecting on the truth they carried. Emma's journey had led her to this moment, where the weight of the past no longer felt like a burden. She had transformed her pain into a lesson that resonated far beyond the walls of her school, one that called on all who heard it to challenge the power dynamics in their own lives and to never stop fighting for what was right. In the end, Emma didn't just survive the ordeal. She emerged from it wiser, stronger, and more resilient than ever before. The closure was not in the resolution of the conflict with Miss Carter, but in the reclamation of her own power, her right to be heard, respected, and valued. The resolution of Ms. Carter's story was not one that could be neatly wrapped up with a single, simple conclusion. As the weeks went on, the community's reaction to her fall from grace became more complex. For Emma, the teacher who had once controlled her every move, the fallout was a mix of consequences, regret, and the slow, inevitable march toward accountability. Initially, Ms. Carter's defense was a firm and unyielding one. She had spent years building her reputation as a strict, no-nonsense educator. Her students' success had always been a point of pride for her. She denied the allegations, insisting that her methods, though stern, had always been intended to motivate her students to perform at their highest potential. To her, the confrontation with Emma had been an isolated incident, one that had spiraled out of control through a misunderstanding. She was unwilling to admit that there had been any systemic misuse of power on her part. However, as the investigation continued, cracks began to appear in Ms. Carter's narrative. The testimonies from former students, the patterns of erratic behavior, and the mounting evidence all pointed to a darker reality, one in which Emma had not been an isolated case. The Board of Education took action, and the disciplinary process moved forward. During this period, Ms. Carter was placed on paid leave, and the school announced that she would not be returning for the next academic year. While this didn't yet constitute her formal dismissal, it was the first tangible consequence of her actions. For the first time, Ms. Carter was forced to confront the full extent of her behavior. In private meetings with administrators and a counselor, she began to reflect on her approach to teaching. She struggled to comprehend how her deep-seated beliefs in tough love had become a veil for cruelty. She had built walls around herself, walls that made it nearly impossible to connect with her students as individuals rather than mere projects to be fixed. There was a loneliness in her isolation, a bitterness that had fueled her desire to maintain control at all costs. And yet, amidst the darkness of her downfall, there was a small flicker of recognition. Ms. Carter acknowledged, through tear-filled eyes, that she had crossed a line. The realization was painful, but it was necessary for her own growth. For years, she had been blind to how the power she wielded had shaped her students' lives, not as an inspiring force, but as a toxic one. The process of accountability did not lead to immediate redemption. Ms. Carter's reputation as a teacher, one that had once been celebrated, was tarnished beyond repair. The community that had once revered her for her strict but effective methods now viewed her with suspicion. In the eyes of many, she would never be able to escape the shadow of the abuse she had perpetrated, nor would she be able to erase the damage she had done to the trust between teacher and student. Yet, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, there was a glimmer of hope. Ms. Carter's suspension gave her the space to truly reflect on her actions, something she had never allowed herself to do before. She started attending therapy and began to understand the deep-rooted insecurities that had fueled her desire for control. This process of self-examination was painful, but it became the foundation for her potential redemption. As she faced her own personal battles, Ms. Carter made a choice. She would never be able to undo the harm she had caused Emma or the other students, but she could commit to change. For the first time in her life, she began to acknowledge that teaching was not about molding students into something she thought they should be, but about understanding and nurturing their individual potential. In the end, Ms. Carter's arc was one of accountability. Her downfall was inevitable, but it led her to a deeper understanding of herself. Whether or not she would ever be allowed to teach again was uncertain, but the lessons she learned in the aftermath of the scandal would shape the rest of her life. The real question now was whether she could forgive herself for the damage she had caused and move forward with a new sense of purpose. Emma's journey had been anything but easy, but as the dust finally settled, she found herself standing at a precipice, looking out onto a future that felt both uncertain and filled with possibility. The scars of her experience with Ms. Carter were still there, etched into her memory, but they no longer defined her. What had begun as a quiet act of resistance had transformed her into someone stronger, more confident, and most importantly, someone who had reclaimed her voice. When Emma first stepped into that classroom, she had been a passive observer, a student who did her best to blend in, to not draw attention to herself. She had allowed herself to shrink, to cower beneath the weight of Ms. Carter's authority, fearing the consequences of speaking out or challenging the power dynamics in place. But now, she was no longer that girl. She had found the courage to speak up, to confront her fear, and to challenge the wrongs that had been imposed on her. The experience had taught her that she was worthy of respect, not just from her teachers, but from everyone around her. Over the weeks following the incident, Emma became a quiet leader among her peers. She didn't seek attention, but her classmates noticed the subtle change in her. She carried herself differently now. Her posture was straighter, her voice more confident. She had learned to stand up for herself, but also for others. Emma realized that empowerment wasn't about exerting control over others. It was about recognizing one's own worth and having the courage to speak out against injustice, no matter how big or small. Her transformation wasn't just internal. Emma's relationships with her classmates began to shift. She became more open, more willing to share her thoughts and experiences. Her friends, who had watched her suffer in silence for so long, now turned to her for support and guidance. Emma's story had inspired them, and in the aftermath of the incident, they found the strength to voice their own experiences, to challenge the systems that had kept them in line for so long. But the greatest transformation Emma experienced was in her own sense of identity. No longer was she a victim, defined by the actions of a teacher who had abused her power. She had learned that she was more than what had happened to her. She was a young woman with her own dreams, her own voice, and the power to shape her future. Emma discovered that her journey wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving, about becoming the person she had always been meant to be. Her sense of empowerment also rippled out into her academic life. Where she had once been intimidated by her studies and by the demands of her teachers, Emma now approached her education with a new sense of ownership. She wasn't just going through the motions to get by. She was actively engaging with her subjects, asking questions, and pushing herself to learn. Her newfound confidence gave her the courage to apply for scholarships and academic programs that she would have once thought were out of her reach. Ultimately, Emma's journey was one of self-discovery. The lessons she had learned from her confrontation with Ms. Carter, about standing up for herself, about speaking out against injustice, and about finding strength in vulnerability, shaped who she had become. She had taken control of her narrative, and in doing so, she had become a beacon of strength and inspiration to others. Her arc ended not with a perfect resolution, but with a sense of peace. Emma had faced her greatest fears, and in doing so, had emerged as someone new, someone who knew her worth and would never again let anyone or anything take that away from her. The story of Emma and Ms. Carter is more than just a tale of power dynamics in the classroom or the struggle between student and teacher. It is a story about the fundamental human need for respect, dignity, and the courage to stand up for what is right. Through their journey, the audience is reminded of the importance of accountability, the impact of authority on others, and most importantly, the power of speaking out against injustice, no matter how small or hidden it may seem. The key takeaway is clear: no one should ever feel powerless in the face of authority, and everyone deserves to be treated with respect and empathy. Emma's story teaches us that silence in the face of wrongdoing often perpetuates harm. She could have stayed quiet, continued to endure Ms. Carter's abuse of power, and remained in the shadows of her teacher's control. But Emma chose to speak up, despite her fear, despite the risks. Her decision was not just a courageous act for her own well-being, but also an act of solidarity with others who may be too afraid to speak out. In that moment, she reclaimed her voice and set an example for others to follow. The lesson is not just about individual courage, but also about the need for broader systems of accountability. Ms. Carter's eventual downfall was a direct result of the collective responsibility of the school community to protect its students. When power is unchecked, it can lead to exploitation and abuse. However, when those in positions of authority are held accountable, there is the possibility for healing and change. Emma's courage inspired not only the school's actions but also her peers, who learned the value of standing together against any form of abuse. But the story also illustrates the importance of growth and redemption, not just for the wronged, but for the wrongdoer as well. Ms. Carter's arc, though one of loss, also presents an opportunity for personal reflection and change. It shows that people are not defined solely by their worst actions. They can change, learn from their mistakes, and become better. However, redemption requires introspection, honesty, and a willingness to acknowledge the harm caused, something Ms. Carter slowly began to realize in the aftermath. Emma's transformation represents the ultimate moral of the story. Empowerment comes from within. It is the ability to recognize your worth, to set boundaries, and to refuse to be silenced or controlled. She learned that standing up for yourself is not just about fighting against external forces, but about finding the strength to believe in yourself, to believe that your voice matters. Finally, this story reminds us that while justice is important, it is personal growth and transformation that lead to true healing. Both Emma and Ms. Carter had to confront their fears, their vulnerabilities, and their mistakes in order to move forward. Emma's journey is a powerful reminder that the road to self-empowerment is not an easy one, but it is one worth taking. In the end, the moral is clear. Everyone has the power to challenge injustice, to change, and to grow. Whether it's speaking up when wronged, acknowledging our mistakes, or learning to trust in our own strength, the choice is ours to make. And when we do, we not only change ourselves but also the world around us. Thank you for watching, and for taking this journey with us. Stories like Emma's and Ms. Carter's aren't just fiction, they're reflections of the struggles we all face in real life. Whether it's standing up for what's right or confronting the abuse of power, we all have a role to play in making sure that we protect each other's dignity and rights. If this story resonated with you, we invite you to take action. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel because stories like this need to be heard. Every share has the power to spark a conversation, challenge perspectives, and create change. Have you ever faced a situation where you felt powerless? Or have you been in a position where you had to make a hard choice for the sake of integrity? Leave a comment below and let us know how you relate to Emma's journey or the lessons learned from Ms. Carter's fall from grace. Your voice matters, and it's time to make it heard. Don't forget to hit that bell icon so you'll always be the first to know when new content drops. Together, we can continue these important conversations and, most importantly, help empower each other to make a difference, one step at a time. Thank you for being a part of this community. Remember, true change starts with one voice, and that voice could be yours.